1844, the visions of Andrew Jackson Davis. Andrew Jackson Davis, 1826 through 1910, was a farm boy in Poughkeepsie, New York, the child of a poor and illiterate family. When he managed to become a shoemaker apprentice, the local folks thought that he had about as well for himself could do as expected. In 1843, however, a traveling mesmerist came to town and put several local people into trance as part of a public demonstration. He didn't succeed in mesmerizing Davis, but when a local trader tried again a few days later, the boy went easily into a trance and in that state was able to diagnose diseases and prescribe effective cures. The next year, after developing a reputation as a seer and learning how to put himself into a trance, he had a tremendous vision in which he encountered in the spirits of Galen, the Greek doctor in ancient Rome, and the Swedish mystics Emanuel Swedenborg. He awoke from that vision with the seed of a complex and mystical philosophy in his mind. He immediately began teaching and lecturing. The next year began work on his first and most influential book, The Principles of Nature, which was published in 1847 and went through more than 30 editions in the 3 decades that followed. The Principles of Nature and the many books that followed, teaching his philosophy, established Davis as one of the leading lights in the burgeoning American alternative spirituality scene. His ideas were taken up by the spiritualist movement, which burst on the scene in 1848 and spread from there to most of the occult traditions of the late 19th century United States, helping to lay the foundations for the golden age of American occultism in the early 20th century. His fusion of mystical philosophy with healing was at least as important as his influence on spiritualism and played an influential role in bringing about the fusion of occult wisdom and alternative healthcare that later played so large a part in American occultism. The raping noises were simply an annoyance at first, and the Fox family of Hyattsville, New York, ignored them. Two of the girls, however, discovered that the noises would answer questions they asked. Gradually, they and neighbors who also interrogated the unseen noisemaker came to believe that they were communicating with the ghost of a murdered man whose corpse had been buried many years before in the cellar of the house. Such tales have been common fodder for late-night storytelling since ancient times. Word of the Fox sisters and their conversations with the dead, though spread rapidly through newspaper articles and word of mouth, other people decided to try to talk to ghosts, and some claimed to get results. It was not until people familiar with mesmerism found that a person in a trance could easily speak for the dead. However, that religion of spiritualism was born. The new religion drew heavily on the writings of Emanuel Swedenborg and Andrew Jackson Davis for its theology and derived its practices from France's anti-mesmerist methods. In a classic spiritualistic seance, people hoping to speak with the dead sat in the darkest room with a medium who, after entering a trance, took on other personalities, first that of a spirit control and then those of dead relatives of the others who were present. Raping noises often were heard, and stranger things sometimes were reported. Tables levitating, spirit hands reaching out to touch attendees, messages written on slates in locked boxes, and more. Some of these things actually may have happened. Others were certainly fraudulent. All of them helped feed the furor over spiritualism. Over the years that followed, the new faith became a major presence in the religious life of most Western countries. In its wake, interest in the more traditional forms of occultism also spread. 1850, the Voodoo Queen. New Orleans was one of the very few places in the slave-owning parts of the United States where a large community of free African Americans existed before the Civil War. Most of the members of the community were devout Christians, but some practiced religious and magical traditions inherited from their ancestors in Africa. After the Haitian revolutions broke out in 1791, refugees from Haiti brought the traditions of voodoo to New Orleans to add an already complex religious environment. From the heady mixed came the traditions of New Orleans voodoo. Marie Laveau was one acknowledged leader of the voodoo community in New Orleans from around 1850 until she retired in 1869. She presided over ceremonies on the shores of Lake Pontchartrain on St. John's Eve, June 23rd, when hundreds of worshippers gathered around bonfires, danced to the beat of pounding drums, and took ritual baths in the lakes. The rest of the year, she could be found in her cottage on St. Anne Street, where she prepared and sold magical charms for a clientele that included wealthy white patrons as well as black people. When she died in 1881, every newspaper in New Orleans gave her a lengthy obituary. New Orleans was the most important gateway through which African religion contributed a portion of its rich heritage to Western occultism, but it was far from the only one. All over the world, African slaves clung tenaciously to their traditions and adapted them to fit the resources of their new homes. Although voodoo and its New Orleans offshoot voodoo survived in only a few places, a lively tradition of folk magic known blended more easily with the Protestant Christianity most African Americans practiced and became widespread. By 1900, practitioners of hoodoo could be found in most American cities. 1855, Eliphas Levi's doctrine and ritual of high magic. The real name of Eliphas Levi, 1810 through 1875, was Alphonse Constant, but almost nobody remembers that anymore. Born in Paris, he was a shoemaker's son and spent his youth preparing a career in Catholic Church, but realized he wasn't suited to a celibate life and went to work as a journalist and author instead. His first book, a political manifesto entitled La Bible de la Liberté, the Bible of Liberty, landed him in jail for a short time and gave him his first taste of fame, but the studies that would become his enduring legacy took him in other directions. Pop culture in Constant's time wallowed in romantic notions borrowed from the Middle Ages, and scraps of the occult traditions of the past were among the things that brought to light that was in process. Whereas most of Constant's friends, associates, treated those scraps as mere scenery, Constant sensed the presence of something much more important behind them, a way of understanding the cosmos that lost none of its relevance with the passing years. He plunged into an intense study of the literature of magic, and in 1854 published a cinder book titled Dogme la Haute Magie, Doctrine of High Magic. A second volume, Ritual de la Haute Magie, Ritual of High Magic, saw print the next year, and the two were published together shortly thereafter. Constant understood that prejudice against occultism remained solidly in place, and so chose to publish them under the pen name of Eliphas Levi. The Doctrine and Ritual of High Magic presented the teachings of occultism in a form that made sense to Levi's readers. Drawing on current ideas in philosophy and science, it built a bridge between the 19th century and the teachings of the occult, and a great many people across the bridge in the years that followed. Though there had been some stirrings of interest in magic before Levi wrote, his books marks the beginning of the modern magical revival. Jules Michelet, 1798 through 1874, was one of the most influential historians of the 19th century. As popular among the French leading public as he was among professional historians, he had a talent for a vivid description that brought the past to life for his readers, and he also loved to find unexpected angles from which to understand the past. When the great witchcraft persecutions of the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries caught his attention, something remarkable was bound to come of it. The times were propitious for such a reassessment. Europe in the 1850s was racked with social unrest, and most governments banned political activism on the part of the poor. The poor responded by joining secret societies such as the Carbonaries, which plotted assassination and revolution against the ruling classes. Michelet knew from his research that conflicts between rich and poor had been just as bitter in the late Middle Ages as they were in his time. What if, he suggested, the witchcraft had been condemned so harshly by medieval lords and priests was a peasant secret society, a medieval equivalent of the Carbonari? In his book La Sorcière, The Sorceress, he used his talent for vivid portrayal of the past to imagine the rise, decadence, and destruction of witchcraft as a political secret society that was formed out of scraps of ancient pagan religion and rural folklore in opposition to unjust social order and the church and state that defended it. The book became a bestseller and influenced many other writers, though later historical research disproved Michelet's theory. His conception of witchcraft ended up having a dramatic impact on the history of occultism, for it was Michelet's vision, as reworked by later authors such as Charles Godfrey Leland and Margaret Murray. The modern Wicca can trace its historical origins. 1874, the Brotherhood of Euless. Pascal Beverly Randolph, 1825 through 1875, was an American original, born and raised in the slums of New York City. He was the illegitimate son of Flora Clark, a poor black woman, and William Beverly Randolph, a white man. His mother died when he was a child, and he led a precarious existence until his teen years, when he found a position as a cabin boy on a sailing ship. In 1845, Randolph settled in upstate New York and took up spiritualism as soon as it was born, becoming first a convert and then a medium. By 1853, he was holding regular seances with a sideline as a clairvoyant physician specializing in sexual problems. He toured Europe 3 times, performing seances and meeting influential spiritualists and occultists. Meanwhile, he read spiritualist and occult literature and began to develop his own occult philosophy. During the Civil War years, he set aside his occult interest and helped recruit African American soldiers for the Union Army. Thereafter, he began writing books on occult philosophy and practice and on human sexuality. In a period when most medical authorities insisted that women were incapable of orgasms, Randolph taught that the regular orgasms were necessary for the physical health of both sexes, and criticized men who ignored their partner's sexual needs. On several occasions, Randolph attempted to organize occult societies to teach his unique system of sexual occultism. He suffered from violent mood swings and an uncontrolled temper, though, and succeeded in wrecking each organization shortly after its founding. The largest and most successful of those orders was the Brotherhood of Euless, founded in Tennessee in 1874. Like others, it fell apart shortly after its founding, but it resumed its work the next year after. Randolph committed suicide. By way of the Brotherhood, Randolph's teaching went on to influence many other occult traditions. 1875, the Theosophical Society. The group that gathered in a rented hall in New York that evening could have been any coterie of American occultists. In spiritualism's golden age, such groups were common in every large American city. Is anyone guess how many of those present that noticed the stocky, dark-haired woman sitting among them, or had least hint that her appearance on the scene heralded a major transformation in occultism. Her name was Helena Trivolna Blavatsky, 1831 through 1891, and she claimed to be in contact with mysterious adepts from the East who promised to convey through her the secret teachings at the heart of occultism. Russian by birth, she ran away from an arranged marriage at 17. Her story was that she traveled to Tibet to study at the feet of the masters. Others told tales of her life as a circus performer, fraudulent spiritualist medium, and adventuress. In 1873, she arrived in the United States and met Colonel Henry Steele Olcott, 1832 through 1907, an occultist and journalist with a talent for publicity. The two soon moved in together and drew up plans for an organization that held its first meeting that night in 1875, the Theosophical Society. What set the new society apart from many other occult groups in the Western world was its mission to teach occultism to the public without vows of secrecy. Two massive books by Blavatsky, Isis Unveiled and The Secret Doctrine, helped spread the word, and over the decade that followed, branches of the Theosophical Society sprang up in every Western country. Though its history was full of scandal and controversy, and Blavatsky was dogged throughout her life by accusations of fraud, the Theosophical Societies became far and away the most influential occult organization of its age. 1884, the Martinist Order. Dr. Gerard Incaussi, 1865 through 1916, was one of the leading lights of the French occult scene. A student of the magical lore since his boyhood, he made his living as a physician, but spent most of his free time in the Bibliothèque Nationale, the largest library in Paris, reading old books on magic and alchemy. He joined the Theosophical Society as soon as it arrived in France, but soon tired of its increasing focus on Asiatic traditions. As he felt that his spiritual path called him to occult teachings of the Western world, it was with this in mind that he borrowed a pen name from a list of spiritualists at the back of Eliphas Levi's Doctrine and Ritual of High Magic, Pappus, the physician, and it was as Pappus that he began to write articles and later books on occultism. At some point in the early 1880s, he was initiated into the magical tradition of the Ellis Cohens, which he had passed only quietly since the time of Martinus de Pasquale, and took up the study of the mystical writings of Martinus de Pasquale's student Louis de Saint Martin as well. He and fellow occultist Pierre Augustin Chaboissou, 1868 through 1946, decided to relaunch the ritual dimension of the tradition, which had been all but extinct since St. Martin's time, and in 1884 they founded the Martinist Order. Each of its 3 degrees of initiation came from a different source. The first, or associate's degree, from the Egyptian Masonry or Cagliostro. The second, or initiate degree, from the Beneficent Knights of the Holy City of Jean-Baptiste Willemars, or the third, or superior Inconnu, unknown superior, from the system Incasu and Chaboissou had received from the heirs of Martinus de Pasquale. By the way of the Martinist order, Martinism became a significant presence in the European occult scene in the early 20th century, and by the end of the century, it was found to be all over the Western world. It remains an influential presence in the Western occult circles. 1887, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. To this day, no one knows where the manuscripts came from. It was written in cipher and illustrated with crude drawings of magical symbols. Dr. William Wynne Westcott, 1848 through 1925, a London Freemason and occultist, came by it somehow and brought it to his friend Samuel Mathers, 1854 through 1918, another Freemason with occult interest. The cipher, they discovered, was in a Renaissance manual of secret writings by the wizard Abbot Johannes Trithemius. And with that key, the two men decoded the manuscript and found it outlined the rituals and secret teachings of a magical society called the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. Mathers explained the outlines into working rituals, and Westcott used his contacts in with the British occult and Masonic scene to attract members. By 1890, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn was the most prestigious occult group in Britain, with a membership that included the Nobel Prize-winning poet William Butler Yeats. Members studied a curriculum of occult subjects, including Kabbalah, ceremonial magic, tarot divination, astrology, and alchemy, compiled by Westcott Mathers and an inner circle of high-ranking members. Unfortunately for the order, Mathers and Westcott fell out. Westcott quit, and Mathers turned out to be unstable to manage it on his own. In a series of disastrous political crises between 1900 and 1903, the order tore itself into 3 fragments, each of which then faced further schism and crisis. By 1937, only a few scattered remnants of the original order survived. That year, though, the American occultist Israeli Regardie, 1907 through 1985, who had been initiated into of the surviving Golden Dawn temples in Britain, published the Golden Dawn, a collection of the order's papers. That proved to be the turning point. New, independent temples were founded, and today the Golden Dawn is far and away the most influential magical order in the Western world. 1892, the first Salon de las Rose Croix. The orchestra played the prelude from Richard Wagner's final opera Parsifal. Incense wafted through the air, contending with the scent of hundreds of roses. On the walls, pictures by 63 artists attracted the admiring gaze of patrons. And on the outside of galleries Durand Ruel, the crowds were so thick that Paris gardamettes had to close the street. The opening night of the first Salon de la Rose Croix was off to a splendid start, and in the middle of everything, instantly recognizable by his long black beard and ornate robes, was Paladin. Paladin, 1858 through 1918, grew up in Lyon and came to Paris as a young man. His scathing critiques on mediocre paintings selected from the annual Paris salons won immediate attention and made him a leading figure in avant-garde circles. Like many young intellectuals at that time, he was fascinated by occultism and wrote a series of novels with occult themes. The first of them, Le Vice Supreme, The Supreme Vice, was published in 1884 and became an instant bestseller. A burgeoning literary career and an active life in the Paris occult scene weren't enough for Paladin, though. He wanted to give the symbolists a movement in the art world that focused on mystical themes, the exposure that the official salon had denied them. That led him to convince of a rival salon, and the Salon de la Croix, Salon of the Rose Cross, was the result. The first salon in 1892 broke the grip of the official salon of the Parisian art world, but it was the Impressionists and other avant-garde movements that broke through rather than Paladin's beloved symbolists. 5 more Salons de las Rose Croix followed before Paladin admitted that he attempted to bring occultism back into painting had failed. He remained a prolific author, but he was nearly forgotten by his death in 1918. 1897, the first hoodoo drugstore. From its origin in the era of slavery, the African American magical tradition, variously called hoodoo, conjure, and root work, was practiced mostly by individuals who worked out of their own homes and gathered ingredients for charms in local forests and fields. After the end of slavery, though, black workers found jobs more easily in cities, and by 1900s, most cities of any size had their own African American neighborhoods with black-owned businesses and institutions. People living in cities still had needs that magic could address, but access to materials for charms was more difficult. In response, a commercial hoodoo industry emerged. Among the core institutions of urban hoodoo were drugstores that sold candles, herbs, and other magical substances, as well as ordinary medicines and personal care products. The first, and for many decades, the most famous of those stores were the Crackerjack drugstores on Rampant Street in New Orleans. Started as an ordinary drugstore by George Thomas, it quickly added hoodoo materials to its stock as Thomas learned what his clientele wanted to buy. By the 1920s, the Crackerjack had a reputation that extended across much of the United States, and hoodoo practitioners would travel long distances to buy raw materials there. By then, the Crackerjack had plenty of competition. There were at least 2 more hoodoo drugstores in New Orleans, and most cities with a significant black population had one. Mail-order houses supplied herbs, candles, oils, and powders to customers across the country, despite postal regulations that defined their activities as fraudulent. Many hoodoo suppliers also carried books on Pennsylvania Dutch magic, such as The Long Lost Friend, and as the 20th century continued, classic works of Western occult literature also found their way onto their shelves, just as hoodoo traditions found their way into many other systems of occultism. 1899, Charles Godfrey Leland's Aradia, or the Gospels of the Witches. Charles Godfrey Leland, 1824 through 1903, led the kind of life more often found in romantic fiction than in the real world. Born to a wealthy Pennsylvania family, he learned folk magic from the Irish, Pennsylvanian Dutch, and African American servants in his childhood home. He went to Paris as a young man, took part in the Revolution of 1848 there, returned to the United States and fought on the Union side in the Civil War, and then worked as a prospector in the West before embarking on a career as an author and journalist. Later in his life, he moved to Florence, Italy, where he studied local folklore, seeking traces of ancient Roman and Etruscan traditions. In 1886, according to his later account, he first heard rumors of a secret book circulating among Italian witches. He succeeded in befriending one witch, to whom he gave the pseudonym Maddalena, and finally received from her a copy of the book, which he translated and published under the title Aradia, or the Gospel of the Witches. According to the book, Aradia, the first witch, was the daughter of Diana, goddess of the moon, and her son and brother Lucifer. She went down with her daughter to teach them witchcraft, to strike back at the church and state that oppressed them. All in all, it was exactly the kind of witchcraft that Jules Michelet had imagined back in 1862, and since Leland and has had read Michelet, that they might not have been accidental. To this day, nobody knows if the book backdates from some time before 1886 or whether it was an invention of Maddalena or of Charles Godfrey Leland himself. Some scholars have suggested that Aradia may have been a historical person, an Italian peasant prophetess of the late Middle Ages around whom folk legends grew up. Whatever the source of the Gospel of the Witches, though, it went on to play a central role in the emergence of modern Wicca. 1902, Guido von List's Visions of the Runes. Born in a prosperous merchant family in Vienna, Guido von List, 1848 through 1919, broke with family tradition to become an author. At first, he eked out a sparse living by writing nature articles for magazines, but he found a more lucrative thing with Carnuntum, his best-selling 1888 novel about Germanic tribesmen battling the legions of Rome. After several years of eye trouble, he underwent an operation in 1902 that required his eyes remain bandaged for most of a year. During that year of darkness, he had a vision in which runes appeared to him and linked themselves with verses from the Elder Edda of the ancient Norse. When he regained his sight, he was a changed man and threw himself into intensive research into the runes, ancient Norse and dramatic folklore, fairy tales, and occultism. His first book on the subject, Dolls Gerhimedans der Runen, The Secret of the Ruins, appeared in 1908 and found a ready audience all through Central European occult schools. He became convinced that many of the occult traditions of the Western world descended from ancient German sources and developed an extensive system of occultism that was based on his own interpretation of the runes. With those teachings, though, von List blended popular notions about the superiority of the white race and of Germanic peoples in the particular. From his work sprang a movement that called itself Arisafi, the wisdom of the Aryans, that borrowed heavily from Theosophy but reworked it into support an agenda of pan-German racism. In the next years before his death in 1919, von List proclaimed that a mighty leader, the strong one from above, would soon arise and unite Germanic peoples. He was, of course, quite correct. The year he died, an Australian veteran named Adolf Hitler, who was strongly influenced by Orosophy, began his political career. 1904, Aleister Crowley's The Book of the Law. His family was suffocatingly respectable and his upbringing and education conventional, but Edward Alexander Crowley, 1875 through 1947, was marked for an exceptional destiny. His mother helped things along by deciding that his teenage rebelliousness marked him as the Antichrist, an identity he enthusiastically adopted. Once he left home, he changed his first name to Aleister, wrote pornographic poetry, had sex with male and female partners, and got involved in occultism. That led him to the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, and he was initiated in 1898. The officers of the order in London found him too much to put up with and refused to initiate him into the Adeptus Minor grade, and so he went to Paris and talked to Samuel Mathers into doing so, an action that helped spark the crisis in the order of 1900. In 1903, he set out on a world tour with his bride in Cairo. Over the next 3 days in 1904, a disembodied voice dictated the Book of the Law, which praised passion and violence and gave him enduring cataphrase, "Do what thou wilt, be the whole of the law." Thereafter, his marriage disintegrated and his literary career failed. Crowley became ever more convinced that he was what the Book of the Law proclaimed, the great beast 666, who would replace Christianity with the new religion of Thelema, the Greek word for will. From then on, Crowley's life was a chronicle of unbroken failure. He ran through the money he inherited from his family. His attempts to launch a magical order to spread the gospel of Thelema were blown apart by his erratic behavior, and a commune he founded in Italy got him expelled from that country. By the time he died in 1947, his followers could be counted on two hands, and his estate was worth all of 14 shillings. Not until 1960 did his legacy become a force to contend with the occult traditions of the West. 1910, the Rider-Waite Tarot deck. In a certain sense, it was a match made in heaven. Pamela Pixie Coleman Smith, 1878 through 1951, was a talented American artist with an interest in occultism. Arthur Edward Waite, 1857 through 1939, was a lifelong student of the occult who needed an artist to create an innovative new tarot deck. The two of them met by the way of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, to which both belonged. In 1909, when the Golden Dawn had fallen apart and Waite was head of some of the surviving fragments, he and Smith began work on the project, with Waite providing the symbolic content and Smith handling all the other aspects of the design. In his research into the tarot, Waite had discovered a 15th century version, the Sola Busca Tarot, in which the numbered cards of the four suits as well as the trumps had their own complex symbolic images. The new tarot deck took the same approach. Waite drew on his extensive knowledge of the magical symbolism and the Golden Dawn's tarot teaching to provide each card with a memorable image. Smith painted the images in a crisp, instantly recognizable style that drew on her knowledge of the symbolist movement in art. The deck was published by Rider and Company in 1910 under the name of the Rider-Waite deck. Waite remained an influential figure in the British occult scene until his death in 1939. Smith lived on until 1951, but her interest in occultism was really waning when she painted the deck. In 1911, she converted to Roman Catholicism, and she spent the rest of her life in relative poverty, eking out a living from book illustrations, sales of prints and paintings, and professional storytelling. It wasn't until the 1970s, when occultism became popular again across the Western world, that the Rider-Waite deck took its place as the most successful and influential tarot deck of the 20th century. 1912, Carl Jung breaks with Sigmund Freud. In the early years of the 20th century, Sigmund Freud's 1856 through 1939 research into the unconscious mind kick-started a revolution in psychology, drawing connections between suppressed sexual desires and mental illness that helped shatter what remained of Victorian morality. Among Freud's closest allies in the new psychiatric movement was the Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung, 1875 through 1961. In 1912, however, Jung broke with Freud, rejecting important elements in the older man's theories. The central point under dispute was the role of sex in the unconscious mind. To Freud, everything below the surface of consciousness was dominated by sexuality, and everything that came out of the unconscious, dreams, neurotic systems, slips of the tongue, and more, could be traced back to the erotic desires that had been repressed in childhood. As Jung studied his own dreams, though, he found material that had nothing to do with sex, but reflected things he recognized from books that he had read on the ancient diagnostics and the teachings of alchemy. After his break with Freud, Jung pursued the connection between the unconscious and the occult and found example after example of ancient mystical and occult symbols in the dreams of people who had never encountered those symbols in waking life. He came to believe that below the repressed memories of an individual life, there exists a collective unconscious full of archaic images that appear in myths, legends, and the traditions of occultism. By bringing those images into consciousness, it is possible to achieve individuation, a state of psychological balance and wholeness as far above ordinary sanity and neurotic conditions are below it. As this was music to the ears of occultists who recognized Jung as a kindred spirit for most of the 20th century. As a result, Jungian psychologists became an important resource for occultists who wanted to make their ancient traditions understandable to a modern audience. Rudolf Steiner, 1861 through 1925, was the rising stars of European scholarship, the editor of a prestigious German literary magazine, and the author of several books on philosophy, but his thoughts kept straying back to the theosophical teachings he studied in college and the folk magic he learned from the old herbalist Felix Kogutsky. He began attending meetings of the Theosophical Society's Berlin Lodge, whose members were so impressed by his knowledge of occultism that they soon asked him to give lectures. His talks earned him a continent-wide reputation. In 1912, he was elected president of the German section of the Theosophical Society. Theosophy was in turmoil in those years as its leader, Annie Besant, 1847 through 1933, took it in a more and more erratic directions. In 1912, when Besant announced that an Indian boy named Jiddu Krishnamurti was the Messiah, Steiner quit the society in disgust. Nearly all of his German members walked out with him. Early the next year, most of them joined with him to found a new organization, the Anthroposophical Society. Anthroposophy used Steiner's voluminous writings in the place of the secret doctrine, but kept Theosophy's mission by providing occult instruction to the public. In Steiner's hands, though, occultism, or as he called it, spiritual science, took on a practical dimension it rarely had before. The biodynamic method of organic farming and gardening, an innovative method of education embodied in the Waldorf School, and new approaches to art and architecture all flowed from Steiner's busy pen or took forms in hundreds of lectures he delivered to audiences all over Europe. An international headquarters at Dornach in Switzerland that was founded in 1921 became the nerve center of the new movement. Although Steiner died in 1925, the Anthroposophical Society regrouped and remains an active presence in occultism. 1914, Evangeline Adams acquitted of fortune telling. When Evangeline Adams, 1868 through 1932, visited New York City on that late winter day in 1899, she was already a well-known astrologer and the owner of the hotel where she planned to stay. Eagerly provided with her his birth data. Adams calculated her birth chart and progressed to that last year, but what she saw disturbed her so much that she went to another hotel. The chart predicted disaster, a prediction that was fulfilled the next day when the hotel burned to the ground. Word got out, and by 1905, Adams had so many clients in New York City that she moved there, renting a studio in Carnegie Hall and offering consultations. Her clientele soon included some of the richest and most influential people in New York, among them the legendary financier J.P. Morgan. When criticized for his interest in astrology, Morgan is reported to have said, Millionaires don't use astrology, billionaires do. Under the laws of New York State, though, astrology still counted as fortune telling and was against the law. In 1914, wealthy and influential friends, Adams was brought up on charges of fortune telling. To defend herself, she asked the judge to provide her with birth data for a person he knew and she didn't, and cast and interpreted that person's birth chart right there in court. The reading she gave was an accurate description of the personality of the judge's son. Impressed, the judge said that Adams had raised astrology to the level of an exact science and ruled that astrology no longer could be persecuted as fortune telling. It took years for similar rulings to be handed down in other jurisdictions, but the climate of opinion had changed. By the middle years of the 20th century, astrologers practiced their art undisturbed across the most of the Western world.